Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. So we're going to do a couple of podcasts about trips that were 1 night or 2 night backpacking trips for us that could be hypothetically 1 night or 2 night backpacking trips for you. And the one that we're going to start off with, we're kind of excited about because it's really fresh in our minds. We did it literally a week ago, I believe. And it's called the Loowit Trail. It's the trail that goes all the way around Mount St Helens, which is actually a super cool trail. So basically, I was reading about this before we started, but the entire trail system around Mount St Helens was obliterated when it erupted in 1980. And so I was reading some articles about the people that were tasked with rebuilding the trail, and it was so interesting because most trails are based off of like utilitarian purposes. So like either an old railroad bed went through there, or maybe, it was how a logging company used to access something. But this trail was made to tell a story. So maybe it takes you through the blast zone so that you can see how things are recovering. Maybe it's meant for people to be able to see things from far away. And so I just thought that was a really cool concept for a trail. Another thing that was kind of neat is that this trail apparently is at the elevation almost all the way around where tree line was located prior to the blast. So I thought that was kind of a cool little detail because this trail actually, what's the highest it goes? Do you remember, Molly? Okay, so Molly's going to look into that, but it's not that high. Like, I feel like the highest point is only around 6,000 or 7,000 feet, maybe at the most. And so that's why it was actually a great option for us to do in June. It's a lower elevation trail. So most of the snow, not all as you'll find, but most of the snow had melted, which made it a good option for us to go in this June, where Washington's been having a ton of rain and snow at higher elevations. So that was another little interesting detail that I found. And, just another thing that was really cool about it is when you read the articles that were written kind of in the 1980s, they were thinking like, this is it for this landscape. Like, there's not going to be any life in the lake. There's not going to be any life in the blast zone for like, who knows how long. It could be like decades and decades and decades. It could be hundreds of years. But it's actually really neat, and you should look it up. There's photos that they have of avalanche lilies literally popping through the, like, tephra, they call it. Don't ask me for an explanation about what tephra is, but it came out of the volcano. But they have pictures of avalanche lilies literally coming up through that. And so, like, pocket gophers and all those kinds of things, some of them actually survived the blast because they were underground. And so they, like, would burrow down searching for food and kind of aerate the soil and enrich it. And so it's a really cool area because the first thing that apparently started coming back, one of the first things, was lupin. And when we were on the trail, we actually got to see that kind of blooming. And it's a neat area because they would say that this lake is actually more productive now.
Which lake?
Spirit Lake, sorry. Because it was filled in sort of, so it's not as deep, so it's warmer than most other alpine lakes. So they have more species of fish, is my understanding from what I read. They have more species of fish and that kind of stuff in there than they did prior to the blast. So it's kind of, honestly, it's a nice reminder, I feel like, for people like me who get wrapped up in frustration even when like there's wildfires and stuff like that, thinking like, oh, it's just never going to come back. It's never going to be as good as it was before. And while I would prefer that there would be no wildfires, kind of having that concept and understanding in your mind that nature actually is made in such a way that it can regenerate itself. And just because an area doesn't look exactly the same as it did before it had a huge geological like impact doesn't mean it's not good anymore. So that's my little spiel about the Loowit Trail and kind of what it looks like.
And I'll just pop in to say that the highest elevation was actually 4,800 feet.
Whoa.
Which is crazy because when we had been preparing for this trail before we actually stepped foot on it, I remember reading, like, I think it was in, what's the name of the trek? It's called Trekking Washington.
By Mike Woodmansee.
It's a really cool book that just gives a bunch of different treks that you can create throughout all the different areas of Washington, anywhere from like 30 miles up to, I think this person created like a 200 plus mile trek, and like kind of more on the eastern side of the Cascades. So anyways, reading that book about the Loowit Trail, he mentioned that you feel like you're much higher than you actually are because of the fact that you're like hovering at tree line the whole time. And so you'd almost think that you're at like 6,000 feet or something, but in reality, you're topping off at just under 5,000 feet of elevation. So once again, something that makes it nice depending on the snow levels. I would say I don't think I would have wanted to do the trail any earlier than we did. We ran through a couple stretches of snow that we'll talk about later on in the podcast. Probably the longest like continuous snow that we hit was like maybe a half mile or so. And I wouldn't really care to do this trail on more snow than that. But really cool because it's not like you're going to be circumnavigating another peak in Washington in June, or even early July with, little snow cover. So that was something that was really cool about the altitude. And then the flip of the coin would be later in the year, it's just going to be hotter because you're not going to be up quite so high. So that's kind of when you get to pick what, kind of what the ideal time frame is for you to do the hike, and then factor in the weather, as well as the conditions when you're actually going to hit this trail. But once again, like Carrie mentioned, so amazing to walk through this area and see how the landscape is recovering from the volcanic blast, and just even walk through areas that, once again, people thought may not look like this 40 years ago, to just see the speed at which the area is recovering from such a historic event.
So a couple of things to keep in mind if you'd like to do the Loowit Trail around Mount St. Helens. The first thing is you have to be very aware of what water sources are available. The awesome thing about going right as the snow is melting, or mostly melted, is we had a ton of sources of water. We had, like they'll say there are sometimes areas where you have 10 plus miles with no water, and we never experienced that. This is a trail that can get really hot because you're above tree line basically the whole time, so you're rarely in the trees, so it's very exposed. So for us, fortunately, I feel like we never really went more than like 4 or 5 miles without water, but it's something you have to kind of plan and consider and be very, very aware of. We actually had a listener reach out to us, and he asked if we would share his story with you guys, just because it's something that's important to think about. He started the Pacific Crest Trail, I believe, on the last day that you're able to start the Pacific Crest Trail, which is like the end of May, I think. You guys can look that up. I'm sorry, I don't remember. But he was talking about how he hadn't realized necessarily that the reason that they stop issuing permits after that point is because it starts to become way too hot in the desert. And he actually found himself in a situation where he had to push the button on his inReach, right, to get rescued, because he almost was out of water, and there was still quite a distance between him. Yeah, like about 10 miles between him and the next water cache. And so then in that scenario, you're really relying on the caches that people leave. And I really appreciated that he reached out to tell us that story, and that he wanted us to share it with you guys, because there are so many things you have to think about when planning a trip, and sometimes if you don't hear about it, you just don't know. So,
and I'll just add on to that before you're on the trail, sometimes you're like, oh, okay, just 10 miles without, a place to refill. Like, that's okay. Like, I can carry a few liters and it'll be enough. But then one thing that we found out once we were on trail around Mount St. Helens is that you might calculate out your typical pace, but then you may then encounter some obstacles. Like in this case, we'll talk a little bit later about the different gullies and the boulder fields. So now all of a sudden, instead of, going at maybe 2.5 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour, you're actually slowing down considerably because the terrain is not allowing you to just breeze through. So that's where you could start to get into trouble pretty fast with your estimated amount of water that you need versus what your body is actually requiring. And then if you don't have a refill source available to you, things can turn south really quick. So once again, thank you to that listener for sharing this story and just allowing us to all take a moment to kind of process, like, what is my planning, what is that sequence like for me? And then how am I going to address those either risks or inconveniences along the way? So something to be thinking about, with this Loowit Trail as well, beforehand, to help you decide kind of what time of year you'd like to do the trail.
And I also just want to say, I think it's really powerful when people share their stories about times that they had to bail, times that they had to make that really difficult decision to ask for help, because anyone who is doing cool stuff outdoors probably has, I actually almost guarantee anyone who's doing cool stuff outdoors has a story of them bailing on something. Yeah. And it's not glamorous. It's not pretty. You don't necessarily see that all over Instagram or Facebook, because even when we bailed on the Tahoe Rim Trail, like, it feels like you're a failure. And so I think it's really powerful and important for us to share those stories with each other and to be able to say, hey, either this mistake happened or this thing outside of my control happened, like whatever it was. Even if you make a mistake, it should still be something that you should be able to share and not just get ridiculed. Because I think the thing that drives me nuts is people always want to be like, oh, well, they made X, Y, and Z mistake, and I would never make that mistake. So like, they're so foolish or whatever, for like even things which I've done. But it's like, the thing about an accident is it's an accident. And sometimes it might just happen because you let down your guard for a second. You know what I mean? And so I just think it's really powerful to share stories about times when things did not go as planned or as expected, because it can help others to prepare for them. And also, it's a human experience. We all have mistakes like that can happen to us. So,
and even just thinking about, your decision making on trail, how you're actively planning, like, okay, like, when do I need to eat? At what point do I need to refill water? How many miles should I go today? Like, those are all decisions that you're making on a daily basis. But you also have this reserved right to make a decision to also get off the trail if you're at a point where you either can't continue, it's not safe. And so it's kind of empowering to think about how, like, in the sequence of decisions that we make each day on trail, the ability to get off of the trail is always something that's available to us. And if we're totally I understand that it's important to persevere, and you have to have grit at some point, because even though backpacking is so much fun, it's like impossible that you're never gonna think like, oh, I actually would rather stop. But it's important to have that option on the table to empower yourself to make a decision that's in your best interests, and not to like exclude that option and just like be really bullheaded and go through it. So just like, once again, the decision making that you have both prior to a trail, but then once you're on it, to make sure that you are keeping yourself and others safe.
Okay, so back to planning for the trail. So one thing that I would recommend, especially if you're hiking in Washington, is taking a look at trip reports on the Washington Trail Association, or WTA.
An awesome website.
Mm-hmm. Those are updated pretty often on popular trails, and they really, like, the people who do those, it's like they're writers. They do an amazing job of including all the details that you need. So we knew that we would probably never go more than 4 or so miles without water, and that was just really helpful for our planning. We chose to start at June Lake. It seemed to be a pretty common location to start this year, and this year there is a added layer of complexity for the trail because some of the feeder trails are being closed during weekdays this year because they're repairing this huge landslide that happened in, I believe, like the fall of 2022, I want to say. So you have to kind of definitely plan your trip around that. Sorry. So anyway, we knew that you can't camp in the blast zone, which is a 10-mile distance that spans from the Toutle River to Windy Pass if you're going clockwise. And so we originally were thinking about starting this trail on a Sunday, but we ended up being able to move it all the way back to Saturday. And the kind of funny story is, Molly and I, we love to do stuff that's kind of nuts. And so we had a different plan for this weekend, and we bailed on those those plans because we knew that the weather was not going to be 100% good. And it was a location where having weather that was not 100% good was going to result in just a lot of frustration and difficulty. And it was like, well, we could do that and not have a fun time and maybe not meet our objective, because we always keep turning around on the table, or we could do the Loowit Trail, which is something that's been on our, kind of on our mind for a long time. So we chose to do the Loowit Trail. So when we started on Saturday night, we had,
and why did we do it?
So we had committed to going to a barbecue on Saturday afternoon / evening. That was going to be in Olympia, Washington. And we were excited about it. And so we went back and forth, like, do we go there, sleep at the trailhead, and then start on Sunday morning early? Or should we just go there, clock a few miles on the trail, and then start literally on Saturday evening. And for whatever reason, because of the way that we said we're going to start Saturday evening. So
so I'm just going to mention that we arrived at the trailhead at probably around 6 p.m. and we were on the trail by 6:15, and we decided that we were going to do this trail like a little bit lighter. So instead of bringing our jet boil to like boil water and actually make meals, like have our coffee in the morning and oatmeal or something like that for breakfast, we actually left the jet boil at home, and then we just got like some Subway sandwiches to eat for our supper that night once we were at our camp for the evening. And then we tried something new called Rec Pack, which is what we use for our breakfast in the morning. So we were traveling a little bit lighter, but I was just thinking, I was working with a patient last week and I mentioned to her that we started this trail at 6 p.m. and she was like, wait, you started a backpacking trip at 6 p.m. And it wouldn't be the first time Carrie and I have had a later start for a first day to just get a couple miles down the trail and then go from there.
I would say it's a record for our latest start.
I think you are correct in that. But you know, it was like one of the longest days of the year. So we figured, hey, we'll have like a solid, probably 3.5 hours of daylight. We can make it a decent ways down the trail. So that's exactly what we did.
And honestly, one of the things that I was thinking about too is like, I can either sleep in my car and then have to pack up all my stuff in the morning because I'm going to bring it anyways. We weren't planning to do the whole 32-mile loop in a day. So I can either sleep in the car and carry my backpack and then sleep outside and then carry my backpack and then drive home. Or I can sleep outside and then carry my backpack and then drive home, basically, because we were planning to do it in 2 days. So we got there about 6:30, which we had wanted to get there a little earlier, but guess what? We visit. Yeah, we got on trail at 6:15. And honestly, the really nice thing is the trail up to June Lake is like such mild elevation gain in our opinion. It was like wide enough for an army, easy to follow, just super cruisy up to June Lake. Like when we got to June Lake, I was like, oh, we're there already? I think it was about 1.5 miles. And I would say, honestly, if you're someone who's looking to do a first backpacking trip with like a little kid or something like that, that would be such a great option because it's very, it gives you a great feel of wilderness, but it's also a pretty easy trail if you're someone who has at least a little bit of like fitness. So we made it up to June Lake I literally rode, what time? Like 6:50. No, we made it up to the Loowit Trail by 6:50. So we were there very quickly. And then after you get to June Lake, there's like a very steep, rooty climbers trail-esque trail that takes you up to the Loowit Trail. So the interesting thing about the Loowit Trail is there's no road that touches it. You have to take a separate trail, a connector trail to be able to access it. And we had gone through a ton of different scenarios. You can start at like the climbers bivouac, which is the spot that you start to, if you've ever climbed Mount St Helens, it's the trailhead that you start for the summer route to climb Mount St Helens. And at first I was thinking that would be a really good plan because then we were doing it counterclockwise. We were trying to get to Windy Pass. That would knock out a few more miles, before the day. But by the time that we were starting, it just did not make sense to start at Climbers Bivouac because it does also add, it's 2.1 miles to reach the Loowit Trail versus the June Lake Trail, which is only 1.5 miles. So we definitely made really good time up to June Lakes. And then even up that steep Climbers Trail, we were all of a sudden at the sign that said the Loowit Trail.
And so it's always interesting when you get to that point because you're like, well, I know I'm going to be at this point again, ideally at some point tomorrow. And so that's kind of a fun thing about a loop trail is you get to like be at the same place both when you start and end the trail. However, caveat, you do not get to end the trail at that point because you have to then take the June Lake Trail back to where you parked. And so is there any other entry points to the trail, Carrie? Because I think the Climbers Bivouac is technically taking the Ptarmigan Ridge Trail up. But were there any other spots a person might start?
So there are several other spots. I don't know every single one of them, but you could take like most years you could take like the Ape Canyon Trail. Oh, sure. There's several trails, but we didn't want to take the Ape Canyon Trail because this whole time we brought enough stuff and we're reserving. We call it reserving the right. We were reserving the right to make this a 2 or 3 day trip. And if it turned into a 3 day trip just because we weren't able to do enough miles, then we would not have actually been able to bail out the Ape Canyon because that is closed during weekdays until 2026 because of the work they're doing on the road. So that's why that option was immediately out for us. Plus, I think it's a longer trail. I think I might add like 3 miles to the total distance of the trail. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. We know this is a little bit shorter of an episode, but it was either 2 shorter episodes or 1 massively long episode. So we chose to go with a slightly shorter one. We hope that you'll join us for the pictures and videos on our Facebook and Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures. And we hope that you'll join us next week to hear more about our adventures on the Loowit Trail. Bye.
Bye.